And Miss Dalloway, Dr. Holmes, and Mr. Bradshaw stand for proportion and conversion. These men look at someone like Septimus, who has suffered shell shock in World War I, what we would call post traumatic stress disorder. They see him and they don't try to pay attention to his individuality. They're not attuned to his particularity, what makes him him and no one else. Instead, they see him as a problem, someone who does not fit into their ideal of what a man should be. And what should a man be, according to someone like Bradshaw, say, is someone who does live according to some sort of abstract principle of order and should conform his life to some abstract principle of order. And those who do not conform to that abstract principle of order must be converted to behave in that way. And this conversion is violent. So for Woolf in this novel, the mental institutions, the physicians who run the mental institutions are ultimately on the side of cruelty because they ignore particularity in the name of some kind of narrow idea. And they try to wrench people out of their individuality and fit them into these concepts, almost like Procrustes. If you think of the Greek myth of the bed of Procrustes, if someone doesn't fit perfectly into the bed, what doesn't fit is lopped off. So we see in Holmes and Bradshaw this. They're not really people so much as walking principles. And as walking principles, they're also uh, cruelly motivated to transform other people into correspondence with their principles. Well, Clarissa sees the same danger of abstraction and work in Miss Kilman. Miss Kilman's religion that she's trying to impose on Clarissa's daughter Elizabeth has the same kind of abstraction and cruelty as the proportion and conversion of Holmes and Bradshaw. And there's a moment, a very important moment in the novel, when Clarissa is thinking about love and religion. Love and religion not as positives, but as negatives, in the same way that proportion and conversion are. And just at that moment, she looks out of her window and sees across the way in another house, through another window, an old woman. How extraordinary it was. Strange, yes, sorry, let me start again. How extraordinary it was. Strange, yes, touching to see the old lady. They'd been neighbors ever so many years. Move away from the window, as if she were attached to that sound, that string Big Ben has just struck. That's the sound that Wolf's narrator is here referring to. Gigantic as it was, it had something to do with her, this sound, this sounding of Big Ben. Down, down into the midst of ordinary things the finger fell, making the moment solemn. She was forced, so Clarissa imagined, by that sound, to move, to go. But where? Clarissa tried to follow her as she turned and disappeared, and could still just see her white cap moving at the back of the bedroom. She was still there, moving about at the other end of the room. Why creeds and prayers and macintoshes? When, thought Clarissa, that's the miracle, that's the mystery, that old lady she meant, whom she could see going from chest of drawers to dressing table. She could still see her, and the supreme mystery which Kilman might say she had solved, or Peter might say he had solved. But Clarissa didn't believe either of them had the ghost of an idea of solving. Was simply this. Here was one room, there another. Did religion solve that? Or love? So this is a major moment where Clarissa speaks out in favor of extreme particularity. Ultimately, a singular being is a mystery that cannot be solved. And while this can be frustrating, confusing, it's ultimately the most important part of life is the kind of sacredness of the individual, that Clarissa is Clarissa and no one else. And she has a kind of radical Clarissa-ness, just as all the characters have their own individuality. But most characters are afraid to delve down into the mystery of their own being. Why? Because it's scary, because it is a mystery, and also it can be isolating. So the price you pay for being honest about the mystery of your own particularity and honest about the unknowability of other people and their particularity, the price you pay is ultimately isolation and solitude. And we see Miss Dalloway throughout the novel express great fear of being alone, but also enjoy being alone, going up into her attic and in her room and reading, having a room of her own, which we know for Woolf is very important. So most characters in the novel in this regard ignore the mystery of being. They live according to ideas. Obviously Bradshaw and Holmes, obviously Kilman does. But Clarissa does not, Septimus does not. This is one trait they have in common. They both are very sensitive to their own particularity. Obviously Septimus to the point that his particularity doesn't conform at all to ideas of what appropriate behavior is, and he's of course deemed insane, and this leads to his suicide. So to think about Septimus a little bit more in connection with Clarissa in this regard, right before he commits suicide, as Holmes and Bradshaw are coming to take him away, basically to eradicate his individuality, he says, "I'll give it you," and then jumps out the window to his death. What does this mean? It's ironic. He's saying, I'll give you my body, but you cannot have my identity. You cannot reduce the mystery of my being to your cruel concepts. And he evades that. And this is one reason why Clarissa, the next time she sees the old woman, which occurs at her party, she retires to think about the suicide of Septimus, which she finds out about when Bradshaw enters the party. Bradshaw brings death into her party, and she's upset about that. She looks at the old woman again, and again has this sense of the mystery of the individuality, the solitude of this old woman, and she thinks, the young boy who committed suicide was right to do it. He was right to do it. That this was his way of expressing his individuality and not allowing society to take it away. So this is what Septimus and Clarissa share in the novel, among some other traits as well. They also like to quote Shakespeare, and they're thinking about the hot sun and the heat of the sun from Cymbeline. But basically, Clarissa in the novel is really trying to think about what I'll call the isness of life as opposed to the oughtness. We talked about how in the opening parts of the novel, she loves the surfaces of everyday life. The flowers, so exciting. Walking on Bond Street, so exciting. She's not constantly trying to make the world meaningful with a big M. She's content with the flux and the flash of the surfaces, the everydayness of life. Because ultimately, she thinks that's what's most exciting about life. It's what's so mysterious about life. But it's such a lark to move among these flashing, exuberant surfaces. So Clarissa is in favor of the isness of life and is not in favor of what I'll call the oughtness of life. The Kilmans and the Bradshaws and the Holmeses are always trying to say life ought to be this way, they ought to be that way. So they reduce the is to the ought, and therefore divorce themselves from the pleasures of the present moment. Whereas Clarissa is constantly trying to escape the ought into the is, into the flux, into the flow. She's sometimes likened to a mermaid on the ocean. That's kind of an ideal state for her. Now, of course, I'm going to talk in another lecture about how there's a counter energy in her, this desire to assemble things into a pattern. But one of her primary traits is, again, this embrace of the isness. And that really comes forth in her gaze at the old woman out of the window on 2 occasions. And it's one trait that she shares, again, with Septimus.